on, the forest seemed to close in around her. Shadows moved just beyond the reach of her headlights, and Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. She tried to focus on the logical explanations, tricks of light, and overactive imagination, the staples of any good ghost story debunker. But then, the static began. Her radio, which had been set to a local station playing soft rock, suddenly filled with harsh static. Ellie fumbled to turn it off, but the knobs seemed to freeze under her fingers. From the white noise emerged a faint, melodious tune, like a lullaby being hummed from a great distance. It was eerily out of place, and Ellie felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Not possible," she whispered, reaching again to shut it off. This time the radio complied, plunging the car back into silence. Ellie's heart hammered in her chest as she tried to dismiss the incident as a freak radio interference. She resumed her narration, her voice a touch less steady than before. Some kind of radio malfunction, probably due to the dense woods. Or she trailed off, her rational mind fighting against the unease that gnawed at her. The road took a sharp turn, and Ellie's breath caught in her throat. There, illuminated by her headlights, was a figure standing in the middle of the road. A woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair long and unkempt, her feet bare. She didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Ellie slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest as the car skidded to a halt mere inches from the woman. Heart racing, Ellie stared out the windshield. The woman's face was hidden by the shadows, her head bowed. "Are you okay?" Ellie called out, her voice trembling as she rolled down the window. No response. She tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Gathering her courage, Ellie grabbed her flashlight and opened the car door. The night air was cold and bitingly fresh. "Hello. Do you need help?" she asked, her light shaking slightly in her hand as she aimed it at the woman. The beam of light fell upon the woman's face, revealing hollow eyes that stared back with a piercing intensity. Ellie gasped, stepping back instinctively. The woman's lips parted, and a whisper carried on the wind, chilling Ellie to her core. "Leave while you can." Before Ellie could respond, a loud snap echoed from the woods, like the breaking of a massive branch. She turned towards the sound, her heart pounding. When she looked back, the woman had vanished. Unnerved but determined, Ellie returned to her car. She knew she should turn back, but the journalist in her needed answers. She drove on, the trees seeming to lean closer, their branches scratching at her car like fingers trying to pull her into the darkness. The road twisted deeper into the forest, and as Ellie rounded another bend, the car's headlights flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. The engine sputtered and went silent, leaving her with only the sound of her own breathing and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Ellie tried the ignition once, twice, but the car refused to start. A sense of dread settled over her as she realized she was stranded in the middle of Millbury Pass, the place where, according to whispered tales, no one ever comes out the same. With her heart pounding in her chest, Ellie reached for her phone, only to find it dead, despite having charged it fully before leaving. She was utterly alone, disconnected from the world, enveloped by the dense, suffocating embrace of the forest. The faint glow of the moon, filtered through the thick canopy, was the only light she had. Ellie grabbed her flashlight and camera, her instincts as a journalist momentarily overcoming her fear. If she was going to get out of this, she needed evidence, something to show, something to tell. Stepping out of the car, she shone the flashlight into the looming darkness. The beam pierced the night, casting long, sinister shadows among the twisted trunks. "Okay, Ellie, keep it together," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. She started recording with her camera, narrating her steps in a hushed tone. "I'm now outside the car. Something strange is happening. The electronics have failed, and there's no cell signal. As she walked away from the vehicle, every small sound seemed magnified, a twig snapping, the rustle of leaves, the distant hooting of an owl. The forest felt alive, watching her, breathing alongside her. Ellie's flashlight flickered, and her breath hitched in her throat. She tapped it nervously, and the light steadied, slicing through the darkness once more. Suddenly, from the corner of her eye, she saw something move, a swift, fleeting shadow, darting between the trees. Ellie whipped around, pointing the flashlight in the direction of the movement. "Hello," she called out, her voice quavering. "Is someone there?" No answer came, just the echo of her own voice bouncing back at her, distorted and eerie. She turned the camera towards where she had seen the shadow, holding her breath, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was lurking in the darkness. As she stood there, the cold biting through her clothes, she felt a sudden drop in temperature. A mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around her feet, creeping up like tendrils trying to grasp her. Ellie shuddered, her fear escalating as the atmosphere thickened, the air charged with an inexplicable energy. The forest seemed to close in on her, the trees bending ominously, their branches creaking as if in communication. Ellie continued to film, her hands trembling so violently that the footage was shaky, distorted. She tried to speak, to narrate, but her words were swallowed by the dense fog. Then, clear and piercing through the night, a child's laughter echoed through the trees. It was chilling, otherworldly, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Ellie spun around, her flashlight darting from one dark corner to another, trying to locate the source of the sound. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. "Show yourself." But the laughter only grew, louder and more manic, until it was all she could hear. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, and the silence that followed was oppressive, heavy with unspoken threats. Ellie felt a gust of cold air pass through her, chilling her to the bone. She wrapped her arms around herself, backing away slowly towards her car. That's when she saw them, figures emerging from the mist, their forms vague and shifting. Children, or what looked like children, with hollow eyes and gaunt faces, dressed in tattered clothes from another era. They moved towards her, their feet barely touching the ground, their eyes fixed on her, unblinking. Frozen with fear, Ellie could only watch as they approached. She raised her camera, the act of recording giving her a sliver of detachment, a hope that this was just another story, a terrifying anecdote for her blog. But deep down, she knew this was different, this was real. The figures stopped a few feet away, forming a semicircle around her. The tallest, a girl with long, matted hair, stepped forward. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, her voice came through, clear and haunting. "Help us," she whispered, her voice a melody of sadness and despair. "Free us." "Who are you?" Ellie managed to stutter, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" "We are the Forgotten," the girl replied, her eyes glowing with a faint, eerie light. "Trapped in the shadows of these woods, bound by the curse of the one who betrayed us." As the girl spoke, the other figures began to chant, a low, mournful drone that seemed to resonate with the very trees around them. The air vibrated with the power of their voices, and the mist grew thicker, encasing Ellie in a cocoon of spectral energy. Ellie felt her heart pounding, her breaths coming in short gasps as the reality of her situation sank in deeper. The fog seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the chanting, each wave drawing her closer to a fate she couldn't comprehend. "Please, what do you want me to do? How can I help you?" Ellie asked, her voice breaking with fear. "You must break the curse," the girl said, her voice echoing like a wind through barren branches. "Only the blood of the betrayer can free us." "But how? Who is the betrayer?" "I don't understand," Ellie pleaded, her mind racing to find a logical explanation, a way out. The girl pointed towards a gnarled, ancient oak tree at the heart of the clearing. "Beneath the hanging oak, you will find the answers. The betrayer's secrets are buried there." Before Ellie could respond, the figures began to fade, dissolving into the mist as if they were made of it. The chanting ceased abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Ellie stood alone, her only companions the oppressive darkness and the lingering cold. With trembling hands, she turned off her camera and pocketed it, her journalistic instincts overtaken by the primal urge to survive. She knew she should flee, drive away as fast as she could and never look back. But the journalist in her, the part of her that thrived on uncovering the truth, urged her to investigate. If there was even a slight chance she could help those souls, wasn't it her responsibility to try? Armed with nothing but her flashlight and a growing sense of dread, Ellie approached the hanging oak. The tree was colossal, its branches sprawling like the arms of a giant, and as she drew closer, she could see something dark and ominous dangling from one of the limbs. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized it was a noose, swaying gently in the breeze as if it had recently been disturbed. The ground beneath the tree was soft, the earth disturbed. Old, deep roots were exposed, twisting through the soil like serpents. Ellie knelt down, her hands digging through the cold dirt, driven by a desperate need to uncover the truth. Her fingers hit something hard. She brushed away the dirt, revealing a small, rusted metal box. With a deep breath, Ellie pried open the box. Inside, she found a collection of old, yellowed letters bound together with a faded red ribbon. She carefully untied the ribbon, her fingers numb with cold and fear, and began to read by the dim light of her flashlight. The letters were written in a shaky, almost illegible scrawl. They told the story of a betrayal so deep, so vicious, that it had led to a curse that bound the souls of the children to the forest. The writer spoke of remorse, of a desire to make things right, but was ultimately consumed by fear and guilt. As Ellie read, the wind seemed to carry whispers through the trees, the voices of the children urging her to continue. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the writer of the letters was none other than the founder of the nearby town, a man celebrated as a hero in local history. According to the letters, the children had been orphans, entrusted to his care. He had promised them a better life, but had instead used them for his own gain, exploiting their labor until they succumbed to illness and exhaustion. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in the very clearing where Ellie now sat today. The final letter contained a confession and a plea. It spoke of a hidden artifact, a locket that the writer claimed was the key to lifting the curse. The locket had been buried with him in his family crypt, located in the old cemetery just beyond the woods. Ellie's mind raced as she pieced the story together. To break the curse, she would need to find the locket and return it to the hanging oak. It was a lot to process, a task that seemed as dangerous as it was impossible. But as she stood up, clutching the letters to her chest, resolve hardened within her. She couldn't leave those children to suffer any longer, not now when she was so close to setting them free. Determined, Ellie headed back to her car, hoping it would start. She needed to reach the cemetery before dawn, before whatever forces that watched over these woods could tighten their grip on her. As she walked, the forest seemed to come alive around her. Branches reached out, snagging her clothes, tripping her up. The wind howled, a mournful sound that seemed like a warning. Shadows danced in the corner of her eye, and she could feel the weight of countless eyes upon her. Every step took her deeper into the heart of the nightmare, but turning back was no longer an option. Ellie reached her car and, to her immense relief, it started on the first try. She drove towards the cemetery, her mind swirling with the chilling revelations from the letters and the eerie encounter with the spectral children. The forest seemed less dense as she approached the town's outskirts, but the sense of dread lingered, clinging to her like the cold mist that had enveloped her in the woods. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, wrought iron twisted into sharp, unwelcoming spikes, as if warning off any who dared to enter after dark. The moon, now shrouded by thick clouds, cast meager light over the gravestones, creating a landscape of shadows that shifted and whispered with the wind. Ellie parked her car just outside the gates and gathered her courage before stepping out. The air was heavy with the scent of moss and decay, typical of old graveyards, but unnerving in the current context of her mission. She clutched the flashlight more tightly, its beam cutting through the darkness as she ventured into the cemetery. Their paths were overgrown, the graves neglected, a stark contrast to the story of the town's illustrious founder whose betrayal she had uncovered. Ellie found it difficult to reconcile the revered image of the man celebrated by the community with the sinister figure described in the old letters clutched in her hand. As she walked among the tombstones, reading the names and dates eroded by time, she felt the eyes of the dead weighing on her. The wind carried low, mournful sounds that could have been cries or merely the groaning of old trees surrounding the cemetery. Every so often, a chill would sweep through the air, making her shiver and glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching her. Finally, she found the crypt. It was a small, stone structure, more humble than she had expected, standing alone in a particularly shadowy corner of the cemetery. The door was made of heavy iron, and it took all of Ellie's strength to pull it open, the metal screeching in protest. Inside, the air was musty, thick with the dust of ages. Her flashlight flickered as she stepped inside, causing her heart to skip a beat. She steadied her nerves and directed the beam towards the sarcophagus in the center of the crypt. It was adorned with an effigy of the town founder, his stone face serene, betraying none of the guilt confessed in his letters. Ellie approached the sarcophagus, her footsteps echoing oddly in the small space. She laid the letters down on the cold stone before searching the crypt for any sign of the locket. It was nowhere to be seen on the surface, so she began to feel along the edges of the sarcophagus, her fingers searching for any hidden compartments or loose stones. As she searched, the air grew colder, and the faint sound of children's voices filled the crypt, echoing softly through the stone chamber. Ellie froze, listening. The voices were whispering in unison, a litany that was too low for her to make out the words. She felt a rising panic but pushed it down, focusing on her task. Suddenly, her fingers brushed against a small protrusion near the base of the sarcophagus. She pressed it, and a small section of the stone slid away, revealing a hidden niche. Inside, wrapped in a faded velvet cloth, was the locket. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she picked it up, the metal cold and heavy in her hand. She opened the locket, and inside was a portrait of the founder, his eyes seeming to stare into hers, full of sorrow and regret. The other side of the locket was engraved with a sigil, a complex pattern of lines and circles that she didn't recognize. As soon as she touched the locket, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Ellie clutched the locket tightly, a sense of urgency flooding through her. She needed to return to the hanging oak, to the children waiting in the shadows of Millbury Pass. She replaced the stone cover and left the crypt, the echoes of the children's voices following her as she made her way back to her car. The drive back to the forest felt longer than before, every mile stretching on as the sounds of the night seemed to press in around her. The locket lay on the passenger seat, its presence a palpable weight in the car. Ellie's thoughts raced as she navigated the winding roads leading back to Millbury Pass. The shadows seemed to lean closer, the night darker than before, as if the forest itself was aware of her mission and either aiding or hindering her, she couldn't tell which. When she arrived back at the hanging oak, the atmosphere had changed. The air was charged, electric with anticipation. Ellie stepped out of the car, the locket in hand, and walked towards the massive tree. The mist was rising again, swirling around her feet, but this time it felt different, less menacing, more welcoming. As she reached the tree, the voices of the children crescendoed into a tangible presence. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, shapes of the little ones she had seen earlier, emerging from the mist, their eyes hollow yet expectant. Ellie stood before the hanging oak, its branches swaying as if in greeting. She opened the locket, holding it out before her. A soft, eerie glow emanated from the sigil engraved inside, casting strange, dancing shadows on the ground. The air hummed with energy, the atmosphere thickening with each passing second. "Is this what you wanted?" Ellie asked, her voice steady despite the palpable fear tightening her chest. "Will this free you?" The whispering intensified, the words still indistinguishable, a chorus of hope and sorrow mingled together. The children formed a semicircle around Ellie, their forms more defined now, bound by the faint shimmer of moonlight filtering through the leaves. Ellie took a deep breath and stepped closer to the tree, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the bark with the locket. The moment the metal made contact with the tree, a surge of wind blasted through the clearing, the leaves rustling violently as if in protest or perhaps liberation. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air was filled with a chorus of cries and laughter, the sounds merging into a haunting melody that resonated with the soul of the forest. Ellie could feel the energy swirling around her, the sigil in the locket glowing brighter, its light piercing through the darkness like a beacon. As the wind and voices reached a crescendo, Ellie felt a sharp pain in her palm. She looked down to see a drop of blood welling from where the locket had cut into her skin. Her blood dripped onto the roots of the hanging oak, seeping into the soil. The moment her blood touched the earth, the atmosphere shifted, the air suddenly clear and the oppressive weight of the forest lifting. The children's figures began to fade, one by one, their faces showing expressions of peace and gratitude. They vanished into wisps of mist, leaving Ellie alone under the ancient oak, the silence profound after the tumultuous events. Ellie stood there, stunned, watching the last vestiges of mist dissolve into the night air. The locket's glow had dimmed, now just a dull shimmer. She clutched it to her chest, a mix of relief and disbelief coursing through her. She had done it. She had broken the curse. Or had she? As the initial shock wore off, Ellie began to feel a creeping dread. The forest around her seemed too quiet, too still. She glanced around nervously, the flashlight in her other hand casting long, eerie shadows among the trees. She turned back to the car, her footsteps quick and purposeful. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, a gaze she could feel prickling the back of her neck. She quickened her pace, almost running now, her breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. When she reached her car, she fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She glanced back at the hanging oak, half expecting to see something or someone emerging from the darkness. But there was nothing, only the old tree standing solemnly in the clearing, its branches swaying gently as if in farewell. Ellie got into the car and slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. She started the engine, the familiar sound offering a small comfort. As she drove away, her headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the narrow, winding road ahead. She tried to focus on the road, but her mind was racing, replaying the night's events over and over. Had she truly freed the spirits of the children, or had she unleashed something else, something far more sinister? The questions plagued her as she drove, the road seemingly stretching into infinity before her. The further she drove, the more the unsettling feelings grew. The darkness seemed to press in on her, the shadows moving in sync with her car as if chasing her. Ellie's eyes darted to the rearview mirror repeatedly, half expecting to catch a glimpse of something unspeakable lurking in the shadows. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the road ahead, a shape too large and misshapen to be human, its features obscured by the darkness. Ellie slammed on the brakes, her heart in her throat, as the figure loomed closer, the details becoming clearer in the beam of her headlights. It was not one of the children, nor anything remotely human. It was a creature of shadows and mist, its form shifting and undulating as if comprised of the very darkness that surrounded it. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, burned with a malevolent glow, fixing Ellie with a stare that froze her to her seat. The creature moved towards the car, each step causing the ground to tremble slightly. Ellie could only watch, transfixed as the creature approached, the air around it seemed to thicken, the darkness deepening until Ellie could barely see beyond the beams of her headlights. The creature's form was fluid, a shadow manifesting from the forest's deepest fears, its outline ebbing and flowing like smoke. Each step it took was accompanied by a soft, ghostly whisper that seemed to speak directly into Ellie's mind, words that twisted in meaning, too terrible to fully comprehend. Ellie's heart pounded against her ribs like a drum, her breath caught in a vice of fear. She knew she had to move, to escape, but her body refused her commands, frozen by the creature's hypnotic gaze. It stood just a few feet from the car now, its size overwhelming, towering over the vehicle as if it were a mere toy. Without warning, the creature raised its appendage, an arm, perhaps, or something akin, reaching towards the windshield with fingers that tapered into tendrils of mist. The glass began to frost at its touch, spiderweb cracks creeping across the surface. "Go away!" Ellie screamed, her voice finally breaking the paralysis. She slammed her hand down on the horn, the loud blare slicing through the night, momentarily startling the creature. Taking advantage of the moment, Ellie threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as she backed away. The creature recoiled, its form shimmering as if disturbed by the noise and the sudden movement. Ellie didn't wait to see its reaction. She spun the car around and accelerated down the road, the engine roaring in protest. As she drove, the creature faded into the darkness behind her, but the sense of dread lingered, clawing at her mind. Ellie's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see the creature pursuing her, but there was only the empty road and the looming trees. She drove without direction, the need to escape the only clear thought in her mind. The road twisted and turned, a labyrinth within the woods, each turn seeming to lead deeper into darkness. Ellie's mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. The children, the locket, the curse, had it all been a trick, a lure into something far worse? As the night wore on, Ellie became aware of a faint light growing in the east, the first hints of dawn. The approaching light brought small comfort, but her relief was short-lived. The road ahead was blocked by a fallen tree, its massive trunk lying across the asphalt, leaves whispering as if in warning. With no way to drive around, Ellie stopped the car, her breath fogging the window as she peered into the forest. The edge of dawn cast long shadows that twisted into shapes that danced at the periphery of her vision. She knew she couldn't stay in the car, it was a temporary haven, nothing more. Gathering her remaining courage, Ellie grabbed the flashlight and stepped out into the chilly morning air. The ground was wet with dew, the grass slick under her feet as she approached the tree. She needed to assess if she could move any part of it, or if there was any way to signal for help. Suddenly, the air shifted, a cold gust that felt like a warning. Ellie turned, her flashlight beam slicing through the morning mist. There, on the edge of the road, the shadows gathered and swirled, forming into the shape of the creature once more. It was as if the dawn had not weakened it but instead given it a clearer form, its malevolence focused and even more terrifying in the half-light. Ellie knew she couldn't run, the creature would catch her in seconds. Her mind raced, searching for any solution, any weapon at her disposal. Her eyes fell on the locket, still hanging from her neck. The sigil inside had glowed with power before, could it be the key to her salvation now? With trembling hands, Ellie opened the locket, holding it out towards the creature. The sigil began to glow, a bright, searing light that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the forest itself. The creature hesitated, its form wavering under the light of the locket. "Back!" Ellie shouted, her voice firm with newfound resolve. "Back to the shadows from whence you came." The creature let out a sound, a wail that echoed through the trees, a sound of pain and rage intermingled. It recoiled further, the light from the locket burning brighter, searing the darkness away. Ellie stepped forward, pushing the advantage, her every step firm despite her fear. The creature retreated, its form dissolving into the mist, becoming nothing more than a whisper of smoke carried away by the wind. As the creature vanished, the sun broke fully over the horizon, its rays like a benediction. Ellie stood alone on the road, the locket still in her hand, its light dimming as the darkness retreated. She was alone, exhausted but alive, with the dawn painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The air around her was now calm, the oppressive dread lifted, leaving behind a silence that was almost holy in its purity. Ellie looked around, the normalcy of the forest returning as birds began to chirp, unaware of the night's terrors. She clutched the locket tightly, feeling its warmth against her palm, a stark contrast to the cold touch of the creature. With the rising sun as her witness, Ellie made a vow. The horrors of the night, the truths she had uncovered about the town's founder, and the spectral children deserved to be known. She would write her story, not just as a tale of supernatural dread but as a warning of the darkness that lurks in forgotten places, waiting for the unwary. Turning back to her car, Ellie maneuvered around the fallen tree, her movements mechanical, driven by a newfound purpose. She would leave Millbury Pass behind but take its secrets with her, shared not for sensationalism but as a solemn reminder of the past's enduring presence. As she drove away, the locket resting on the passenger seat beside her, Ellie glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind her was empty, the forest retreating into the normalcy of daylight. Yet, in the depths of her mind, the echo of the children's whispers lingered, a ghostly chorus that would never quite fade away. Ellie reached the edge of the woods, the town coming into view, its streets quiet in the early morning light. She realized then that her journey through Millbury Pass was more than a test of her courage, it was a confrontation with the past, a battle with the embodiment of darkness that fed on forgotten sorrows. Stopping her car outside the local coffee shop, she took a deep breath, appreciating the mundane scene before her. People inside sipped their morning brew, laughing and chatting, oblivious to the night's shadows she had faced. Ellie smiled faintly, a sense of camaraderie with these unknowing individuals filling her. They were reminders that life, with all its light and shadows, was a precious thing, worth every moment of fear for the peace that followed. With a renewed sense of duty, Ellie gathered her notes and the locket, preparing to write her story. It would be a tale of darkness and light, of curses born from betrayal and the redemption that brave souls could bring. She would write about the spectral children, ensuring their memory lived on not as shadows of terror, but as spirits finally at rest. As she set her pen to paper, Ellie realized that the true horror of Millbury Pass wasn't the supernatural creatures or the chilling encounters. It was the forgetfulness of humanity, the ease with which we ignore the sins of the past, allowing them to fester and grow in the shadows. Her article would challenge that forgetfulness, shining a light into the darkest corners of human history. And as the sun rose higher, casting long, cleansing shadows across the town, Ellie felt a lightness in her heart. She had faced the darkness, both within and without, and emerged not just unscathed, but stronger. Her story, a blend of horror and hope, would serve as a beacon for those willing to listen, a call to remember and respect the deep, often painful roots from which our present reality grew. Her tale of Millbury Pass would end not with the closing of her notebook, but with the beginning of understanding, a ghostly whisper in the minds of her readers, urging them to look deeper, to remember, and most importantly, to learn. The haunting of Millbury Pass, both literal and metaphorical, was a tale for the ages, a reminder that the past, no matter how dark, always had lessons to offer the living. As Ellie's words flowed onto the page, the whispering wind seemed to carry away the last vestiges of darkness, leaving behind a trail of ink and the promise of dawn. The horrors of the night had passed, but their echoes would resonate, a haunting melody of resilience and warning for all who dare to remember.